came to pass on the third day, when she had ceased praying, that she put off her mean dress, and put on her glorious apparel, and being splendidly arrayed, and having called upon God the overseer and preserver of all things, she took her 2 maids, and she leaned upon one as a delicate female, and the other followed, bearing her train. And she was blooming in the perfection of her beauty, and her face was cheerful, and it were benevolent, but her heart was straitened for fear. And having passed through all the doors, she stood before the king, and he was sitting upon his royal throne, and he had put on all his glorious apparel, covered all over with gold and precious stones, and was very terrible. And having raised his face resplendent with glory, he looked with intense anger, and the queen fell, and changed her colour as she fainted, and she bowed herself upon the head of the maid that went before her. But God changed the spirit of the king. Gentleness and an intense feeling, he sprang from off his throne and took her into his arms until she recovered. And he comforted her with peaceable words and said to her, "What is the matter, Esther? I am thy brother. Be of good cheer. Thou shalt not die, for our command is openly declared to thee. Draw nigh." And having raised the golden sceptre, he laid it upon her neck, and embraced her, and said, "Speak to me." And she said to him, "I saw thee, my lord, as an angel of God, and my heart was troubled for fear of thy glory. For thou, my lord, art to be wondered at, and thy face is full of grace." And while she was speaking, she fainted and fell. Then the king was troubled, and all his servants comforted her. And the king said, "What wilt thou, Esther? And what is thy request? Ask even to the half of my kingdom, and it shall be thine." And Esther said, "Today is my great day. If then it seem good to the king, let both him and Haman come to the feast which I will prepare this day." And the king said, "Hasten Haman hither, that we may perform the word of Esther." So they both came to the feast of which Esther had spoken. And at the banquet the king said to Esther, "What is thy request, Queen Esther? Speak, and thou shalt have all that thou requirest." And she said, "My request and my petition are, if I have found favour in the sight of the king, let the king and Haman come again tomorrow to the feast which I shall prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do the same." So Haman went out from the king very glad and merry. But when Haman saw Mordecai, the Jew, in the court, he was greatly enraged. And having gone into his own house, he called his friends and his wife Zosara. And he showed them his wealth, and the glory with which the king had invested him, and how he had caused him to take precedence and bear chief rule in the kingdom. And Haman said, "The queen has called no one to the feast with the king but me, and I am invited tomorrow. But these things please me not, while I see Mordecai the Jew in the court." And Zosara's wife and his friend said to him, "Let there be a gallows made for thee of 50 cubits, and in the morning do thou speak to the king, and let Mordecai be hanged on the gallows." But do thou go into the feast with the king, and be merry. And the saying pleased Haman, and the gallows was prepared. Shalom Aleichem, Assalamu Alaikum. Welcome to Esther chapter 5. There are 14 verses in this chapter. In verse 1, there's an omission of having called upon God, the overseer and preserver of all things. And really the full verse has been omitted. I'm not going to read it all. I already did in the narration portion. But there is another mention of the name of God. So now 25 if we're doing a count. Oh, 26 now. Okay, verse 2, big difference, another big difference, an omission of the full verse. And I'm not going to read that either. I read it in the narration. Verses, the shorter verse, which is abbreviated as Esther basically walked up to the king's scepter and touched it. So you can't simply walk up to Mordor, walk boldly and rebelliously to the king and say, okay, I'm going to touch your scepter. I'm home free. No, it doesn't work like that. As we read in the Septuagint, it's very romantic, actually. It's written almost like a romance novel, very descriptive and full of important details that when you omit this emotional aspect and the relationship that is quite evident between the king and Esther, I was going to say the king and I, but the king and Esther, it's understandable that he would have mercy upon her. You can see how much he cares for his Queen Esther. So she wasn't just bold and rebellious, saying we just walk in and touch the scepter. That's not how it happened. He even touches the scepter, notice, against her neck, which is a very vulnerable spot of the human body, connecting the body to the head, to the brain. It's very, very... people will know if you injure that part of your body, you will be paralyzed below the waist. You will be quadriplegic, essentially. So that is an important aspect of anatomy. Verse 4, an omission of today is my great day. That's quite an expression. It seems she is a little optimistic. We can tell she's she's hopeful that things will turn out for her good. And the king is a kind person, has a kind heart. Verse 6, there's an omission of the name, Queen Esther. So notice the king is calling her by name. What is thy request? No, not just what is thy request, whoever you are. Queen Esther, he's calling her by name. The scriptures say, call your friends by name. It's a scriptural, social standard of behavior. Verse 8, it says the king, we're actually not looking at that. Okay, verse 9. It says here, in addition, he stood not up nor moved for him. Mordecai did not stand or move. So Haman was greatly enraged, notice in the Septuagint, merely at the sight of Mordecai. He didn't have to do anything. He just saw him and he was angry. He was peeved. In the Masoretic, he stood or did not stand or move. So it did not take that. Didn't take anything, just simply the sight of Mordecai for Haman to become emotional. And then the last thing I will bring up in regards to this chapter is verse 14. It says that Mordecai will prepare gallows. His friend suggested this to him, to prepare gallows. And the word for gallows, there's a footnote which reads in the Greek, a tree cut, which could be a messianic reference. I'm not sure. So I'm going to write that down. Possible messianic symbolism, question mark. Okay, so that's all for this chapter. Thank you very much for your time. Until next time, I bid you all Shalom Aleichem, Assalamu Alaikum, Irini Mazisu, Pax Vobiscum, peace be unto you, and Maranatha.